Welcome, everyone. I'll introduce myself. My name is Jacquelyn Sundberg, and to those of you on Zoom, I extend a special invitation today to turn on your videos if you are comfortable with doing so. We are recording today's meeting, but only the presenter's video will be recorded. So you are on screen just to show the people in the room who is joining us and from where. So if you are willing, let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from, and you're joining about, I don't know, say 20, 25 people here in the room. Unfortunately, we can't provide coffee for those of you joining us remotely, but there will be coffee at the back of the room for those of you who are here in person. My name is Jacquelyn Sundberg. I might have mentioned that story. I'm outreach librarian, and it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here today for this event to celebrate with our editors, the authors, the project participants, and the network. Yes, waving. Unfortunately, they can't see you, but just a moment, just a moment. Everyone can wave to everyone online. And they're waving back. I want to start today with a land acknowledgement. We are on McGill's downtown campus, and it's a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations. We are continuing the tradition of the exchange of ideas that has been signifier and an important part of this piece of land for a very, very long time, for generations before there were settlers here, long before possibly these sisters were corresponding in Madras. So today it really is a pleasure to launch this book, which is the culmination of a network's effort. It's much more than the people in the room today, and you can see the messages popping up in the chat, which is kind of nice for you here in person. I will keep closing them as they come up, however. So for today, we really are celebrating all of the different people who went into making this publication a reality. And that is a large network. I saw the very beginnings of this project when Victoria and Lauren and the partners and Anna were dreaming up what the Gwillim project could be at the grant stage. So I was there when they were putting in their first SSHRC application, and it was it's a milestone every time you get a SSHRC application in. And to see this one come to fruition, to bear such fruit, and to grow such a network internationally is really a feather in the cap of all participants, but it's nice to see a project from beginning to end. So it's a pleasure for me personally to launch this today. So I'm going to pass the microphone now. I'm going to invite our colleague from the history department to come up, who's going to be moderating today, and we'll give introductions to all of our speakers.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start with just a personal congratulations on this wonderful book. It's been such a treat to read it, and also such a physically beautiful book. I imagine that most people here know the project and its content, and people will be talking about it. But I thought just to start, I would just very briefly read from the description at the back of the book, just to contextualize it, and then I'll introduce the people who are here, and then we will have people come up and talk about their work. In Women, Environment and Networks of Empire, Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds in Madras, an interdisciplinary group of scholars used the paintings and writings of Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds to explore natural history, the changing environment, colonialism, and women's lives at the turn of the 19th century. And Stair of York University comments, for those who value close historical study of a time and a place and new historical sources, this book and the trove of primary materials unearthed by the researchers of the Gwillim project that it contains give us a window onto British, Indian, imperial worlds, 19th century material culture, foodways, clothing and textiles, and natural history, as well as women's work in art and science. It's an extraordinary plethora of things that flow from this truly remarkable archive. The contributors who are here today who will be talking to you include Lauren Williams, who's the curator of the Blackerwood Natural History Collection in the Rare Books and Special Collections Department of the McGill University Library, and one of the principal investigators with Victoria Dickenson on the project. Victoria Dickenson is a former curator and museum director who writes in the areas of museums and material culture. She has a PhD in the history of science from Carleton, and has also published extensively in the history of natural history, as well as environmental and culinary history. She's currently Professor of Practice, Rare Books and Special Collections at McGill Library, and has a number of ongoing research projects in the Blacker Wood Natural History Collection, including the new project that we will be hearing about. Anna Winterbottom is a research associate at McGill University. She's a historian of science, medicine, and environment in the Indian Ocean region. She's the author of Hybrid Knowledge in the Early East India Company World and co-editor of the East India Company and the Natural World and Histories of Medicine and Healing in the Indian Ocean World. Professor Vikram Bhatt is an eminent professor emeritus of architecture at McGill. Among other things, he is the author of Resorts of the Raj, Hill Stations of India. And he's co-author of After the Masters, Contemporary Indian Architecture and Blueprint for a Hack. He's an expert on housing and urban design, and is very interested in colonial urban development. Anne Was is an independent costume history scholar who had an earlier career with the Riversdale House Museum in Maryland, in the United States. And her research interests include federal Regency era costume and social history, as well as the clothing of enslaved African Americans. And she has a distinguished career presenting in both academic and popular audiences. Professor Nathalie Cooke is Professor of English at McGill University, whose many publications focus on the shaping of culture and literary taste. And she was the Associate Dean of the McGill University Library from 2016 to 2022, with an oversight for rare books and special collections, and does many other things. And finally, Dr. Minakshi Menon is a research associate in social studies of medicine at McGill University. She has led a research group, a working group at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She recently edited a special issue of the journal South Asian History and Culture, entitled Indigenous Knowledges and Colonial Sciences in South Asia. And she's working on a monograph with the working title Empiricism's Empire, Natural Knowledge Making, State Making and Governance in East India Company, India, 1784 to 1840. And I think just giving you a sense of the biographies of the people just in this room gives you a sense of the remarkable collaborations and interdisciplinary work that this project has involved. I wanted to start by asking Lauren Williams, the curator of the Blacker Wood Natural History Collection, can you tell us something about the collection that sparked this project? What is the collection? What is its importance? And who are the sisters at the heart of it?
Thanks very much. And thank you for that introduction. It's great to see everybody here today. So as was mentioned, I'm the curator of the Blacker Wood Natural History Collection, which is the collection within Rare Books where the Gwillim paintings are held. And the Blacker Wood collection was established in 1920 through the efforts of Dr. Casey Wood. And he was an ophthalmologist who, toward the end of his medical career, became fascinated with the study of bird vision. And this interest led him to begin collecting works on ornithology, but his library soon grew to include material on all aspects of zoology. And then after it was donated to McGill, the collection continued to grow, and it now holds material covering all of the natural sciences from the medieval period right up to the 20th century. And we now hold more than 20,000 books and over 10,000 pieces of original artwork, making us the largest natural history library collection in Canada and one of the most significant collections in North America. And I feel like gesturing this way because it's just behind this wall here, if anyone is interested. But it's really the unique items like manuscripts, like letters, field notebooks, and paintings, which make this collection really special. And the Gwillim paintings are a very important part of that. It was actually Dr. Casey Wood who acquired the Gwillim paintings for the collection back in 1924. And he describes having found them at a London rare bookseller's shop. And he went into the shop and asked the seller if he had any material relating to animals. And apparently the seller went down into the basement and pulled up a massive dusty portfolio full of these paintings, which must have been sitting down there for decades. And as Wood started to look through the paintings, he recognized immediately not only the artistic skill of the sisters, but also the scientific accuracy with which they depicted the birds and flowers and fish in the paintings. And so he immediately decided to buy the collection for McGill, and we really owe everything to the keen eye of Wood that day in 1924, because if he hadn't recognized the value of these paintings, we might never know the work of the Gwillams. And since the paintings arrived at McGill, we've known bits and pieces, but we haven't actually had a very full picture of who they were, what their lives were like, and context in which they created these paintings. And so it really takes dedicated scholars and interested patrons to bring a collection like this to life. And so we're also very indebted to the work of Victoria Dickenson and all of the contributors to the Gwillim Shirk Research Project, because we now have this incredibly rich and detailed picture of not only the Gwillams' lives, but also the context in which they created these paintings. And this will serve as just an incredible resource for all future students and scholars who are interested in studying the collection. So thank you. And I'll leave it to them to tell you more about the project and the sisters. Thanks.
Well, that segues very nicely. Victoria Dickenson, can you tell us about this project? Can you describe the aims of the group and the collaborations that arose around it?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And it's a delight to be able to talk about this project because it's a wonderful moment to have the culmination in the publication. I want to say thanks to Casey Wood and thanks to Eleanor McLean, who began a catalogue of the Gwillim paintings when she was the librarian of the Blacker Wood. And I happened to come upon them and started to look through the Gwillim paintings. And Eleanor told me she always wanted to work on them and hadn't quite had enough time. I thought, well, that's interesting. So I started to look at them. And as I looked at them, it led me to a number of people. And this was the beginning of the network. The first person, and he's on screen actually. Well, he's off screen right now. Jeffrey, Jeffrey, get back here. We can't see you. Anyway, Jeffrey Spear at New York University, who was working on the Devadasi, or the temple dancers in Madras. And he had discovered in the British Library correspondence by Lady Gwillim about the temple dancers. So he found that this material was at the Blacker Wood, and he actually funded the digitization of the paintings of the birds in 2006. So thanks to Jeffrey, it started the whole process of digitization. And also thanks to Jeffrey, who will eventually come back on screen, he led me to the correspondence of the Gwillim sisters at the British Library. There are over 700 pages of correspondence from Elizabeth and her sister, Elizabeth Lady Gwillim and her sister Mary Symonds. And at the time, they were not digitized. They were not available. But they are now available thanks to the British Library as scans and thanks to some of our students as transcriptions. And I particularly want to acknowledge Rebecca McCallum, who was Lady Elizabeth, and who was Mary, and Amelia and Greenfield, who was Lady Elizabeth. They basically made the transcriptions possible. Those transcriptions are also going to become available on the Oxford Text Archive, and thanks to Anna Winterbottom for initiating that. So the Gwillim letters are now much more available to a wider audience, and they're wonderful letters. I used to read them and think I was reading Jane Austen. So wonderful, wonderful correspondence. That the British Library connection led us to Norwich and the South Asian Museum. And the South Asian Museum, our co-editor, Ben Cartwright, who can't be with us today, but at least not in person, but Ben had acquired with the South Asian Museum Mary Symonds watercolors in the early 2000s. So here is the other sisters' watercolors. And they are the subject of a catalog which has been published by the South Asian Museum. Discussion with the South Asian Museum and the British Library led us to Rosemary Riddell. Rosemary Riddell was an Ottawa scholar who had started to work on the Gwillim sisters. Again, fascinated by their correspondence, she connected with the Hereford archives, learned a lot about them. And her daughter, Rosemary Riddell, is deceased, but her daughter, Jane Riddell, the archivist of the Mercers Guild in London, made available all her mother's notes and transcriptions to us. And so that was a wonderful way to begin the project. But of course, the bird paintings were critical to the project. And I found an article in 1994 by Subbu Subramaniam. So this article was on Lady Gwillim's birds, and that introduced us to Subbu. So Subbu, who is, I know, with us today online, had written an article on Lady Gwillim's birds. At the same time, Madhav Badami, who's here in person in the room, said, you really should connect with more people in Madras and Chennai. And then he mentioned Vikram Bhatt. And then along came Vikram, who written on garden houses. So he became part of our network. I realized too that my colleague Nathalie Cooke had a real interest in culinary history and a particular interest in curries and having been grown up in India. And so this became another interest. So you see the beginning of the network, this interest coming from the material culture and spreading to people interested in it. Anna Winterbottom then came into the project and introduced other people with the Indian Ocean World Center here at McGill, Vanita Damodaran, for example, at the University of Sussex. And we put together a SSHRC application. It was a partnership development grant coming from the IOWC and the library. And thanks to Jacquelyn, who I remember tracked everybody down on the grant in the early days of trying to get all the material in. We were successful in 2018. We also received funding from the Shastri Foundation. Again, Madhav had suggested that, as well as Digital Museums of Canada. So this was going really well. We worked on transcriptions from 2018 to 19. And in 2020, April, we planned our first symposium. And I'm sure all of you remember what happened around February 2020. So our first symposium never took place in person, but we were able to segue to an online format. And I particularly want to thank Emily Zinger, who now is the East Asian digital librarian at Cornell, who tested online presentation platforms. She tested them to see which one we should choose. And we chose, thank heaven, Zoom. So we did our 9 webinars on Zoom. People in the room participate in those webinars, but people from the entire network, which now numbered over 50 people, participate in those webinars, and they've had over 30,000 views. So far more than we could have had for a symposium at McGill. So a wonderful collaboration there. We also, thanks to our students, developed a website and a network newsletter. And I noticed that CL is online here. And CL has been working on a podcast for which she received special funding so that we will be hearing in sort of their own words and in different voices, the Gwillim and Mary Symonds as they read their letters. So I can't mention all our students, but we had over 15 students working on the project, and they all contributed amazingly to the project. This network that grew was small, as I mentioned, it grew to over 50 people. Ann Wass is here from Baltimore. And I also want to acknowledge she worked with Alexander Kim, and I noticed that Talika Gupta is online from Delhi, which is great. Minakshi's in the room. She was in Berlin at the time, now here at McGill. And we also started to add participants from other museums. So we worked with the Aga Khan Museum, the Dakshina Chitra Museum in Chennai, and I particularly want to thank Deborah Thiagarajan, the director there, for all her wonderful work. And with IIT Madras, and I want to thank Professor A.J. Urfi and John Lorduswamy, who are there. The result of this collaboration, it's more than just the book, but I'm delighted to see the book is being launched today. And I want to thank all the authors, including 2 of our students, Hannah Niksevich and Serafina Masters, both of whom went on to do PhDs and get jobs in their chosen fields and who have contributed to the book. My special thanks to Lauren Williams, who gave so much access to the Blackerwood collections and made all those queries that we had over the many years. She was very patient with. Jennifer and Chris from from the Rare Books and Special Collections, who supported the project. Greg Houston, who digitized the birds had been done, but Greg did the fish and the flowers, and then he would redo stuff when I had special queries. So thank you, Greg. I really want to give a big hand to McGill Queens. Jonathan is here, Jonathan Crago, and he believed in the book at the beginning, and it is a wonderful book. It's beautiful. So they've made this book possible and lovely. And I want to thank all the participants of the network, who I cannot all name, and to just acknowledge the power of collaboration. It makes such a difference to work with colleagues who have a share in interest, but come from so many different backgrounds. It's been so enriching. And also thanks to all our students who were perhaps more savvy with technology than we were, and who made it possible for us to use new means of communication to bring a truly global network together. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It might be interesting to switch to thinking about some of the themes and ideas that came out of the project. So I wanted to ask Anna, who's one of the lead editors and authors, what were the main themes that emerged for you from your work on the Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds?
Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Thanks for the question, and thanks for talking to us today. And as echo Lauren and Victoria's thanks to everyone in the network, and as well as all of you here today. I think there were so many themes that came up, and many of them did emerge from the network and also from our students. So perhaps I'll just talk about the three main ones, which ended up in the title of the book. So women, environment, and networks of empire. So personally, I'm really interested in how knowledge is created in colonial spaces. And for me, a big interest in this project was to think about how women, how female natural historians or sort of proto-scientists worked in these spaces. Did they interact differently with their environments compared with their male counterparts? And I think in many ways we found that the answer was no. They were looking for similar things. They were looking for recognition from the scientific community. They were participating in projects of the day, such as transplantation and economic botany. But one thing we did find is that as women, they tended to document their surroundings in perhaps more complete ways than their male counterparts. So as well as their botanical work and their ornithological work, they also painted their surroundings. So they painted people that they interacted with, and they painted landscapes. And this allowed us to understand a bit more about their networks, and the networks that were so important in the creation of knowledge in this colonial space. And I think the most important of these networks were with Indian experts. So they interacted with local physicians in Madras. They interacted with the people who collected plant specimens for them and told them about their medicinal virtues. And they interacted with people who caught the birds for them. And one example of how this sort of multi-dimensional approach to documenting their surroundings that we found particularly interesting was Mary Symonds' image of the bird catchers. And Serafina Masters, one of the research assistants, did a very nice detailed case study of this for the book. But the image of the bird catchers shows how important these people were in not only catching the birds, but keeping them alive. So the bird catchers have the birds swaddled in cloth. And so you can see how this expertise enabled the very realistic depictions of birds that Elizabeth Gwillim produced. So these were their local networks. On the ground, they were also networked with East India Company physicians who were very important participants in company science, and who also were important in transferring specimens and knowledge to and from between Europe and India in this time. And beyond that, they also had other networks, so networks with women. And again, they interacted with the environment in very specific ways, I think because of their gender. So they were thinking about which plants could they grow in their gardens, what might they cook, and Nathalie Cooke can tell you more about that. And how were plants used for textiles, and Ross, who's here, can speak more to that. So a lot of their networks also involved other female experts. And finally, environment. I think again, the ways in which they documented their surroundings were very important in understanding the environment. So in the landscape pictures, we can see how different the landscape was from what we see today in Chennai. So we see a very watery landscape. We see marshlands and rivers and irrigation networks of tanks for irrigation. So that's a very striking way in which they documented the natural environment. I think also our collaborations with scientists were so important in the environmental aspect of the project. So Subbu Subramaniam was able to identify all of the bird species that Elizabeth Gwillim painted. And several of these birds are now endangered or they're rare in the region. And similarly, we worked with experts to identify many of the fish which are shown. And again, that tells us something about the marine environment. So I think lots of our network who are here today and lots of the other authors will have more things to say about these themes and about others. So stop.
Thank you so much. So we will have time at the end for questions, so save your questions for an open discussion. We thought it would be very interesting, however, to have people talk a bit about their individual contributions. So I wanted to ask Vikram if he could tell us about the environment that the sisters come to. What is the built environment of Madras, and how did the sisters interact with it? How did the environment change them, if it did? And maybe also, what did they leave out when they talked about it?
Tricky as always, aren't you? No, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. We have to situate the two sisters and their husband, one husband coming to Madras in a kind of historical cycle. They arrive at the beginning of 1800. The travel from Europe to India took more than 3 months. You came around the Cape and you settled. That means the amount of stuff you can bring with you is very limited. So these two sisters who arrived there, they have to set up a household. To set up a household, so they are the real frontline individuals who are confronting the reality of a totally different climate, totally different physical setting, and the day-to-day necessities of home. So it kind of reminded me of me coming here at the beginning of the 70s, where I couldn't find coriander and ginger. So that is and I was strict vegetarian when I arrived. It changed quickly. But so here, the women are arriving and they have to set up a household in extremely hot climate. So what they have recorded in different ways, especially Mary, their own homestead, their own gardens surrounding the homestead, how the houses were built, how the house is organized, how in their correspondence they kind of describe this homestead where they are having a dinner party, how the breezes pass through this very beautiful verandas and open spaces, how they are fanned when they go for a party to a big higher officials place at the end of the day, where the fans are made with vetiver and water is sprayed on them, and how this built environment goes into it. So you ask how they were changed. They were more immersed than changed in this place. The other aspect worth remembering historically is Sir Gwillim is the first puisne judge. So the establishment of the colonial kind of project is just beginning. And it would be at least a decade after that the trade between Europe and South Asia starts to change the direction. Here they are at the stage where the riches from the South Asia are to be sent. There is no trade coming from the other side. The posh travel will take 100 more years. All of you know the meaning of posh, how the word comes from? And that was because the steam travel that began were in vessels which were made of vessels, which were very hot before air conditioning. So if your cabin was on the other side, you would be in the sun all through your journey. And so therefore you would not take the rooms on that side. So this comfortable travel, how you set up the household, all these things was much, much after. So the way they interacted with these places is very important. The other very important aspect we learn about this is their worldview of Madras is their worldview. They didn't move around or travel through whole of British colonial territory. They were primarily within 100 kilometers of Madras. So what they documented physically in terms of their landscapes is quite stunning. What do we find in birds, bird paintings? That's where it was quite revealing. One set of birds that Elizabeth did is like landscape, insight into the real physical setting within which these birds and humans were all living. So there are two paintings outside in the cabin where you will be able to see the bird of coil, the cuckoo birds, and there you will see how they relate with the landscape, but also the physical burial shrines which are integrated with these things and so on. So by looking at just bird painting, you are learning so much about the physical environment and the way in which they interacted. And the correspondence describes it. House plans are drawn, what kind of gardens they will be making, what plants and so on. So it's a journey and a time capsule that we just have opened. We still have a lot to learn.
Thank you. Anne wrote on textiles. What can we learn from the material history of textiles, and particularly in this colonial context?
Well, before I answer Elizabeth's question, I just want to set the stage. We, as fascinating as the paintings are, we relied heavily on the letters of the sisters. And what we have from the sisters is their letters back home asking to be sent things and then responding when they received things, of course, in their social environment, and the fact that they couldn't bring very much with them, and the fact that the laundry practices were particularly harsh on their garments. They needed to have things sent from England. And then they sent things back to England as souvenirs, as gifts. And this is where we find then, obviously, clothing is made of textiles, but they also sent textiles. And we look at the early 19th century, those of you who know what styles are in the early 19th century, the quintessential vision of what a Regency or a woman wore, of course, they're pre-Regency, but it continues into through the early 19th century, is a white muslin dress and a luxurious cashmere shawl. Muslin was a very fine white fabric originally made in India. However, the sisters found that it was expensive to buy in India. They had to get it from Bengal, so they'd have to have someone send it to them from Bengal. And one of the sisters said once, and you always have to buy more than you want, so it would be expensive. So they actually got muslin that was produced in England from their network back in London. So we have English muslin coming out to India, sometimes made up as a dress, but sometimes just in fabric. But they did send some muslin back as well. And we also see how the East India Company was keeping an eye on things, and with tariffs and all. Once they mentioned the delicate stratagem of sending fabric out folded up in a letter, so it didn't look like a big package of textiles. Once they sent muslin back from India, kind of basted together to look like a made-up dress instead of like yard goods. So we see that. We also do see that they bought shawls. Shawls were often, though, bought used. But one interesting thing that we did not know as dress historians until we started reading their letters is that they would send shawls, but they would be cut up when they got back to England. They might cut a long shawl in half. And we're like, how in the world did you do that and get a finished edge? They would also cut shawls up to make men's waistcoats. And that's something we see very, very few of. We went looking to see if there are any extant examples of waistcoats made out of shawls. We found like 3. We figured the fact that they were made out of wool probably meant that they were worn out and moth-eaten. But in the case of shawls also, you begin to see in Europe shawls being made in imitation of the Indian shawls, especially in the Scottish town of Paisley. This would have been a little bit later than them, but about 1812, they start weaving shawls in Paisley, Scotland. And so now we tend to call that motif that's so characteristic on a shawl, the Paisley. So we see that the English first were getting raw cotton from India, and then, of course, starting to manufacture it into fabrics. And muslin could be in all different grades. There might be very fine sheer muslins. There might be ones that Jane Austen herself complained didn't launder very well. They fell apart. But then, of course, in the early 19th century, England starts importing raw cotton from the United States. And along with that, the United States in the southern states was using slave labor to produce the cotton. So the simple clothing and textiles, again, kind of expands to look at all kinds of different aspects of international trade and networks. And we just found it very, very satisfying to be able to work with our own colleagues, which we very seldom get a chance to do, and then to be part of the network too. And we just found it's just extremely gratifying. We're so grateful to Victoria for getting us on board.
Nathalie Cooke wrote about food. Nathalie, maybe how do colonial encounters shape the globalization of foodways? But maybe more specifically, what does the example of these sisters writing about food suggest about larger histories, perhaps of the emergence of what you term Anglo-Indian cuisine? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Thanks to everybody who's here today. And thank you for those of you who've turned on your cameras, because it's showing us some of the ironies of this project. So my last name's Cooke, and I was looking at food history. I look at social food history, and so I was very interested in Anglo-Indian cuisine before I came to this project. And it became very clear that I was actually looking at very detailed evidence at a relatively minute scale. So we were looking at correspondence, Anne and I scrutinized the correspondence for the kinds of details it would give us about day-to-day life. So while Anne was looking at fabrics, what people were wearing, how they were, transforming saris into waistcoats, I was looking at some of the ingredients and how they were being used and how they were being tasted in the household. And so what I looked at was actually the adaptation of foodways. And you heard the best example already. Vikram got up here and said, I arrived in Montreal and there was no ginger and no coriander. And we all went, oh, what an impoverished life we led, right? And And we see something very similar in the letters. So we see 3 stages of culinary adaptation. So we see the sisters, who are actually very adventurous, as you can imagine. They're drawing beautiful images of the birds and they're observing what's going on around them. But the first thing they notice is they don't have the things they want, and that they really, really think are just the luxuries of life. And for them, the biggest symbol of this was strawberries. So when they arrived, they just couldn't find strawberries of the kind that they had appreciated in England. And there was quite a lot of ink and pencil ink that was spent on strawberries. About 80 years later, they would actually have extraordinary strawberries in that part of India. But when they arrived, they really were finding that they had to adapt to a very different food taste. On the other hand, and this was the first stage, they were upset about the things they couldn't find and they were needing to either get from England. The second stage was they actually started to see all the wonderful things around them. The more than 1,000 species of fish, many of which they'd never seen before, and quite a few of which they drew in beautiful ways, right? So they would see this wonderful richness, and they would start to realize that there were things in this new environment that were different, but not only could approximate what their English food tastes and palates enjoyed, but could actually lead them to new and enriched tastes. Think of coriander, think of ginger, and just reverse it. You know, that they were starting to find this wonderful sensory experience, and they were really willing to try. And then the third stage is where they really actually have adapted, and they're starting to put things on their table that are not just approximations of what they had in England, but are really actually what we would now call Anglo-Indian cuisine, but it was a cuisine of adaptation. So I just want to end with a couple of ironies. So first of all, I'm looking out at the live audience here, and it includes some of our library colleagues who haven't been mentioned yet, but who helped us with the digital aspects of this particular project. So I'm looking in particular at Jen Riley back there, whose team included Greg, the digitization expert, but who managed to put a number of these gorgeous images and projects online at a time when we weren't able to see one another. And then I'd like to figuratively look behind me, because that's where the two-dimensional faces are, and just say, when we walked into this room today to celebrate a physical book, which we can hold, right? We saw people who we've been interacting with for what, a couple of years now, in 3 dimensions. And we've done it at least I've done it 5 times, looked at people and said, oh, and Anne's my example here. I was Anne. And there was this moment of recognition. You're in 3 dimensions. And so there was this amazing irony in this project that we were working internationally. Victoria brought together a fabulous group. Jacquelyn and I have seen it through from the beginning, through this. Anna was an extraordinary, diligent editor with a fine eye and a kind of sophisticated nuance in terms of encouraging us to change our material. But it was, you know what I mean by that, right? The book is much the better for some very subtle and diplomatic editing going on, but it was this wonderful compromise between an international group and yet a study that involved absolute minute detail, and as you've heard, a focus on a particular area and region in India and a particular set of correspondence and images over roughly a decade. So thank you very much, and thanks to everyone.
And finally, Minakshi Menon, who I think maybe, could I say you wrote about language and power and colonialism and language? Anyway, Minakshi, how would you say post-colonial approaches inform our understanding of the sisters' writing and perhaps its interaction with its imperial context. Yes.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. So here I am holding up the physical book. Elizabeth's question is really a very, very interesting question. And it's something I started to think about almost as soon as Anna invited me to come on board, read the letters, and decide if I could write something based on one of the letters. Now, as I examined the project, I realized that it's basically, we are going to have a volume that has a great deal of wonderful descriptive detail about the natural history of Madras presidency in the early 19th century. And I knew we'd get lots of wonderful details about material objects, about birds, about plants, which is something very close to my heart. But I was also a little anxious that we not take our eye off the fact that the milieu, the context, is one of British colonialism. It's already, by 1800, we're already at a point where British actors themselves have recognized that they are indeed ruling an empire. So to think about that a little, I mean, if we think about the word colony itself, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the Latin colonia, which means possessing somebody else's land, holding land from which original owners have been displaced. What happens when you think about the word imperial and imperialism, correct? Now, as many of us who work on the history of imperialism know, the origins of this word and the origins of the word emperor lie in the ancient Roman context, where initially the word imperium meant the authority exercised, the executive authority exercised by a Roman administrator. And of course, its meaning shifted over time. So when I think about post-colonial theory and ideas of difference that post-colonial theory has given us, and it's a huge gift, one thing that post-colonial theory has taught us to think is how certain groups of people are distinguished as other, as different, as in need of governance, and as in need of certain special forms of surveillance. Now, as I thought about this, I wondered what I could do with the letters, because the letters are describing wonderful everyday occurrences, bonnets, flowers, lovely dinners, but nothing really very specific about the coded violence of the colonial encounter. So I was absolutely delighted when I found the letter on which I based my case study, because that letter immediately tells you that both the sisters were completely aware of the violence of the encounter. Now, in writing about Black English, I mean, what Mary does, and she does a remarkable job that allows us to perform discursive analysis on that letter, is she shows us how clear subordinates, you know, the lower half in colonial social relations were aware that they were in a position of subordination and governance, and how much that stress, that tension simmered on the surface and occasionally broke out, as it did in the colonial, as it did in the Velo Mutiny, which you can find written about in the letters. So to address your question again about post-colonial theory, I think what post-colonial theory in this particular context of this volume has actually given us is the ability to do discursive analysis, to be able to look at recovering voices that are not immediately audible in the archive. Yeah?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
You so much for all those wonderful contributions. I had some big picture questions, but I decided there may not be time. So I think what we might do is open up to anybody who would like to come in from the Zoom world or in person. Does anybody have questions or comments? 17. Oh,
Yes, sorry, I will just pop in there. We just had a camera change. But the 17 comments are not all questions. It's apologies, it's people tuning in from all over. But this is the moment to say, if you are joining us remotely and you have a question for the speakers, do put it in the chat and we can voice that on your behalf. And I will do that on behalf of everyone. But yes, you can open up to questions in the room. We just ask that if you do have a question in the room, we will repeat it from the podium, or you can come up to the microphone up here, just so our Zoom friends can hear you. And hopefully everything is still good in Zoom land. Yes, we have lights, we have sound. Great.
You said too much. Yes.
So I just have a comment. First of all, this was wonderful. I'm so glad I participated. Nathalie, it's wonderful to see you. So I just want to be clear, I'm not a librarian or an academic, so please take whatever I say in that spirit. So what's your name, by the way?
Elizabeth Elbourne.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth Elbourne in History and Classical Studies.
I know the name. That'll need to speak about you. Only nice things. So you opened up your comments, or somebody did, about Casey Wood. So I just find it fascinating. Over the last little bit, the library world here seems to revolve around Casey Wood. Last week, I attended a wonderful event in the Osler Library. I don't remember the person's name. He was visiting from Sri Lanka, and he talked about. Oh, you were there. Right. So he talked about olas, which are. He was talking about the medical manuscripts on palm leaf that are in the Osler Library, and I think some of them are here too. The other thing is about Casey Wood. I have some friends / colleagues, including this young man over here, who were involved in a book that was published by the papers of the Canadian Bibliographic Society, all about Casey Wood. And it's also available online, and it's really interesting to read about Casey Wood, his involvement with Osler, his collecting, his work as an ophthalmologist. But unbeknownst to me, before I read several of the articles, I learned that Casey Wood was also a big admirer of fascism, Mussolini in particular.
For those of you online, I apologize. There is possibly a comment coming. If you can't hear quite clearly, we'll summarize in a couple minutes.
Okay, one last plug is for Nathalie. While you were talking, I was reminded of that wonderful book that you were involved in, Many Voices, Many Women, that just, it ties in very well to this. So if people have a chance, they should look out for that book also. I'll stop.
I'm doing the Vanna White show and tell here for the online tab. Just a few shots of it. I did put the link to the McGill Queen's University Press website in the chat. So if you are online and you want to order a copy, just before I pass it to Victoria for some thank yous, I will put in the plug. This book, as you can see, has some heft. It's also beautifully illustrated by some of the images from these sisters' paintings that are held here and from other collections. And the other thing I will say is you can buy this book for your library. If you're a librarian, please do. I encourage it for your collection. Also, you can buy it for your coffee table because it's a beautiful one, or for your classroom. It's a multi-purpose publication. So there's my pitch, even though I had no hand in getting this book to print. So impartial plug from Jacquelyn for your library collections. We do, for those in the room, just housekeeping notes to close. There is coffee and snacks at the back of the room, and also you can buy a physical copy today.
It looks like we have 3 questions.
And I will go look at the chat.
Look at the questions. And while Jacqueline's looking at the questions, I'll just repeat a little bit of what Stephen said to us from the room. He talked about Casey Wood, the donor, who basically initiated the Blacker Wood collection. And Casey Wood was extremely interested in anything to do with zoology. So he did bring the material from the Gwillim project, for the Gwillim project together here. But he also, as Stephen was saying, He also collected something called olas, which are palm leaf manuscripts from Sri Lanka. And this is a nice segue into the project which grew out of the Gwillim project, which is our next project. Anna mentioned it briefly, Anna Winterbottom, that we looked at the bird catchers and we said, who are the people who have made Elizabeth Gwillim's wonderful paintings possible? And we started to think, are there other collections in the Blacker Wood in McGill at the Redpath Museum, which would benefit from trying to look behind what we know about them from the surface documentation to find out, in a sense, Minakshi's nodding, who made these possible. So we have a new project called Hidden Hands in Colonial Natural History Collections. And Stephen, you were mentioning the olas. These are part of the Hidden Hands project. We're looking at 4 different collections. And the olas, we had Dr. Danister Pereira here last week with us. He was here for 5 weeks, thanks to the Osler, a fellowship from the Osler Library, to look at the ola collections and to really help us understand them, as well as we're looking at a collection of material from flora and fauna, paintings of flora and fauna from from Haiti, what was Saint-Domingue. In the mid-18th century, we're looking at the James Forbes collection made in India, again at the end of the 18th century. And we're looking at the Francis Simpson herbarium at the MacDonald College. And we're looking at in connection with Métis knowledge of the natural world. So we're looking at a woman, young British woman who lived in the Red River, and we're looking at Métis knowledge of plants at the same time. So we're looking for these hidden hands. And I think this project has benefited immensely from the work of Anna Winterbottom. And I just want to acknowledge her again. Let's give her a big hand. Anna has made the book possible. Nathalie was very kind in saying she gave suggestions. She basically was amazing in terms of her editorial oversight of the book. So thank you, Anna. And she is also the research associate on the Hidden Hands project and is working on James Forbes and the Ola collections. And finally, a lacuna that we didn't introduce Elizabeth Elbourne, who started off asking all these wonderful questions. And I'd like to thank Elizabeth Elbourne, professor in the History and Classical Studies Department, who works on colonialism and settlers and is working in South Africa, another interesting area, because of course, everyone who went to India, as Vikram said, stopped in South Africa, including Mary Symonds and including James Forbes. So we have a whole bunch of interesting things to connect. So the network continues to connect and spread. So thank you, Elizabeth, too. So I wanted to get those thank yous in.
Thank you to everybody who came, and just congratulations on this absolutely fabulous project to everybody who is involved. There are tons more questions. There was Jeffrey Spear asked about the role of servants, but I think we don't have time. So I'm going to say maybe that could be answered in the future project. So maybe we can take the questions in person to people here. And thank you everybody for coming. Please enjoy some refreshments and please go and look at the book. Many, many congratulations to everybody.